Hi, it's Miss Norsworthy again. Today we're going to talk about complex sentences. A complex sentence contains at least one independent clause and one dependent clause. Here is our example. John cannot set up his typewriter because the wall has no outlet. John cannot set up his typewriter is independent. Why? It can stand alone. It makes sense. Our dependent clause, because the wall has no outlet, depends on our independent in order to make sense. Notice that the word because is circled because it is our subordinating conjunction. It is making the clause dependent. When you add an independent clause plus a dependent clause, you have a complex sentence. A complex sentence contains one independent clause and one dependent clause. A common complex sentence formula is ISCD, standing for independent clause and then the dependent clause. Now the reason we put SC right here is so that you can remember that a dependent clause always begins with your subordinating conjunction. Notice that there's no comma in this sentence formula. She will go to school in the city until she finds a job. This dependent clause is depending on the independent clause in order to make sense. What happens if you were to switch the dependent and independent clause? If you switch them, you would then need to use the subordinating conjunction dependent clause, comma, IC formula. Here's your example. When I first moved to the city is our dependent clause. There's our subordinating conjunction. We need help from an independent clause in order to make sense. I was afraid to drive the steep and narrow streets. This clause makes sense on its own. But when we have the dependent clause coming first, there has to be a comma after it. This shows the reader that he or she has to pause when reading. Let's take a look at these sentences. They are all complex, but we want to decide where the dependent clause is and what formula is being used. Remember, in order to find a dependent clause, we look for the subordinating conjunction. In this case, we're going to go through and we're going to circle just the subordinating conjunction first. After the players practiced, they went out for pizza. Where's your subordinating conjunction? If you said after, you are correct. We are going to circle it. It's like our headlight. A headlight of a car is the first thing you see on a car. Well, the first thing you see in a dependent clause will always be the subordinating conjunction, so we're going to circle them. If this is our subordinating conjunction, then that means this entire clause is our dependent clause. Let's look at the next clause. They went out for pizza. Does this make sense on its own? If you said yes, then you are right. This is our independent clause. So I wonder which sentence formula we're using. Looks like subordinating conjunction, dependent clause, comma, independent clause. Good job. Let's look at number 2. You will be sleeping when I get to Phoenix. Do you see a subordinating conjunction? I see it. If you said when, you are correct. We're going to go ahead and circle it. That's our headlight. That means it's starting our dependent clause. So we're going to bracket that in and we're going to label it dependent clause. Let's look at the other. You will be sleeping. Is that a complete thought? Absolutely. So we're going to bracket it in and write independent clause. What sentence formula is being used in number 2? You are right. Independent clause, subordinating conjunction, dependent clause. There is no comma in an ISCD complex sentence formula. Let's do number 3. The players went out for pizza after they practiced. Where's your subordinating conjunction? If you said after, you are correct. So let's circle it. It's our headlight. That means it's starting our dependent clause. Good. So let's put dependent clause, and that means the other clause is going to be independent. Let's make sure. The players went out for pizza. Does that make sense on its own? Yes, it does. So what's going to be our sentence formula being used? Yes, I, subordinating conjunction, and then dependent clause. Let's do one more together. Number 4. Until the storm is over, we will not know about the damage. Well, I see until, so we're going to go ahead and circle it. That's the headlight. That means our dependent clause is starting. Notice that we have the comma there. Let's make sure the next clause is independent. We will not know about the damage. That makes sense on its own. This is our independent. So our sentence formula would be SC, D, comma, I. You have to have the comma when you have a dependent clause coming first. Look at 5 through 10 and see if you can figure out each sentence formula being used. Let's have some more practice. This is our sentence formula that begins with subordinating conjunction, dependent clause, comma, independent clause. So you see that in every one of these sentences, we start with a subordinating conjunction, and because we start with a subordinating conjunction, that means that we are starting with our dependent clause, and we are putting commas. So when I get home, what will you do? When I get home, I will eat a snack. Because it is raining. Well, what happened? Because it is raining, the game was canceled. Number 3. I can go play. I can go play after what happened? After I do my homework? I can go play? That makes sense. See if you can fill out 4, 5, and 6. Number 6 is really good. We can say, since I studied for the social studies test, I made an A. The opposite formula for a complex sentence is when you have your independent clause coming first and your dependent clause coming second. Notice, no commas in this complex sentence. I will play outside when it stops raining. The game was canceled because it rained. Notice there is no comma before the word because. That's correct. Commas are never, ever, ever used before the word because. Get it out of your heads right now. There are no commas used before the word because. Look at number 4. The girl cried because she hit her head. There is no comma here. That is one of the most misused commas before the word because. We don't put commas before the word because in a complex sentence formula in the IC dependent clause formula.